Okay. Okay. Well, welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar at Purdue. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nikita Borisov. Nikita is the third visitor we have from UIUC this semester, and he's a faculty member there. His research interests are in network security and online privacy. I think most of you are probably familiar with his work on attacking 802.11. At least when I teach security or cryptography, I made that a required reading. And he received his NSF Career Award in 2010. Today, Nikita will talk about detecting coordinated attacks.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure visiting here and learning about all the exciting work that's going on here. So I'd like to talk to you about some work that I've been doing over probably the past 3 or 4 years looking at using traffic analysis for finding attacks on the internet. So in terms of thinking what are coordinated attacks and why should we care, you can probably think about the botnet threat. So botnets are groups of machines that are compromised that are all centrally controlled for a common purpose. And so they can obviously carry out lots of attacks like sending spam, doing denial of service, stealing information, and so on. And you can see over the last 10 years there's been a huge growth of news attention to botnets. And this has become more and more of a present threat in our lives. And so, for example, just in October of this year, there were 341 Google News articles that discussed botnets and their impact on cybersecurity. So it's a very important thread. So that this is more than 10 articles per month. And you can see that in this first article they mentioned, they talk about criminal empire that's all $70 million. So there's a large amount of financial harm involved from botnets as well. Though if you want to read a bit more about this, there's a nice paper in WISE 09 that discusses some of the caveats of trying to understand how much money is gained or lost through this kind of botnet operation. And the threat doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. So Gartner has this nice report that botnets are expected to dominate cyber attacks until 2013. And so, you know, I guess by 2013, all of my work will be done. But hopefully, I'll have tenure by then, and we can move on to other things. So anyway, this is kind of to convince you that botnet attacks are important to study, though I'm sure most of you don't need all that much convincing. So if we look at botnets and we think about how can we detect the presence of botnets, how can we recognize that we're under attack, there's a bunch of traditional network intrusion detection approaches, signature matching, anomaly detection, and protocol analysis that really fail in face of concurrent botnet exploit techniques. So signature detection is something where you create some sort of pattern that describes an attack or an exploit, and you look for it on your network. But of course, what we've seen recently is that the botnets tend to use new exploits all the time. They can update them as they go along, and so they can discover exploits that no one else has seen before, so there's no hope matching using a signature attack. In terms of anomaly detection, for normal attacks on computers, this is something that is often helpful. You try to see something's out of the ordinary, your computer is misbehaving, and so on. But the thing about botnets is that the botnets are really gain their power from scale. So they go anywhere from tens of thousands to estimated millions numbers of computers. And so what that means is that you can really have a very, very low level of potentially suspicious activity on any single botnet node, and so it's harder to have anomaly detection that recognizes that, and nevertheless have a great aggregate effect that carries out effective attacks. And you can't really analyze so much of the content of the communication, that botnets use because they use encryption. So encryption has been, a great invention. It's been very helpful for network security as it's been more broadly deployed over the past, let's say, 20 years. But of course, attackers are using it to create streams that are indiscernible. And because we have military-grade cryptography is now available to anybody who can, copy and paste 20 lines of C code, this is well within reach of botnet designers. So something that we've been looking at is the use of traffic analysis. And so this is an analysis of what I call side information that exists when the contents of the information is no longer useful to you. So you can't use the contents to manage signatures, you can't understand the protocols and so on, but you can monitor network communications and see what kind of communications are there. Are there some TCP flows with many packets or few packets? Are they large packets? Are they frequent constant rate communications? Are they bursty and so on? This is all side information that can be gleaned by watching communication, even if it's encrypted. So it's very, and in a sense, it also requires a fairly straightforward analysis and monitoring, because you don't need to inspect packets, you don't need to analyze their contents, you really just look at their headers and maybe even not that. And so you can derive all sorts of useful information. You can obviously see who is communicating with whom, and we'll see how that will be useful later in this talk. You can see, you can infer some information about what kind of information the traffic is carrying. So if you see a stream of packets where you see one network packet generated every 30 milliseconds or so, and the packets range from 500 to 1500 bytes, you can probably be sure this is a voice over IP communication session, even if the contents are encrypted. If you see kind of these bursts where you see one small packet go in one direction and you have a burst of packets returned, and this repeats periodically, that's maybe web browsing and so on. So, and one other feature that we will exploit in our work is you can try to figure out whether two communication flows are correlated, where there's some relationship between them. And as, the title of my talk is Detecting Coordinated Attacks. And so most of what we look at is trying to detect the fact that there's coordinated activity that's happening in your network and use it as kind of a sign to identify potential attacks. And so traffic analysis, it actually has a long history. It was been used for a long time by the intelligence community. In fact, it probably is something that's been more visible in the last decade or so. If you've ever heard stories or spokespeople referring to the appearance of chatter that they detect. This usually means traffic analysis. So by chatter, what they mean is that they see that people are talking, they see that people are meeting, so you kind of see the frequency of communication, the nature of who's talking to whom. They don't know what they're saying, right? But they're saying, oh, there's a bunch of chatter, raise the threat alert level, right? So this is where it started. Where I came across traffic analysis is in my research on anonymous communication. So if you're interested, this is something I won't be able to talk about today, but it's a very important tool for analyzing the security of systems that let you communicate over the internet privately. And so more recently, traffic analysis has been used by the security community, and that's largely what I'll talk about. So I'll talk about two applications of traffic analysis. First is finding linked flows, finding two flows that have a relationship between them. And this is an indication of an attack called a stepping stone. I'll describe it in a second. And the second is trying to look at a broader picture of what kind of attacks, what kind of communication exists on the internet, and identifying closely knit we can call them communities, but what they really are peer-to-peer networks, and this is some work that we're doing to identify peer-to-peer botnets. So to explain stepping stones, I want to talk a little bit about attack attribution. So this is your typical scenario today for somebody trying to protect their network. There's an enterprise network you can imagine as being Purdue campus or some company or so on. It's connected to the internet, and there's a system or a collection of systems that are usually deployed called intrusion detection systems. And these are network appliances that will analyze and sometimes filter traffic, and their goal is to detect that an attack has happened. And so one of the things that happens when they detect an attack is that they can identify the source of the attack. They can say this attack came from a given IP address. And this is, of course, in theory, this is pretty useful because you can track down who's attacking you and go after them or block them or whatever. So you can go through, you can see where this connection goes to the internet, and there's lots of services that let you translate this, fairly opaque IP address into an actual location. You can find out where they're located, who's their ISP, whether it's and in some ways go after them. This doesn't always work because sometimes they'll be in some random country in some non-cooperative ISP or so on. But in theory, this is something that should be helpful to investigating attacks. Unfortunately, what can happen is that instead of this being the perpetrator of your attack, this is itself going to be a computer that's been infected or compromised. And what it's doing is it's relaying traffic from another user who's connected to it via the internet. And with a completely different IP address, they can be in a different country, they can be in a different city. And this basically, this computer is used to effectively whitewash or launder away the initial location information. And I don't have it shown here, but you can imagine doing this recursively many times. So you can create a collection of these compromised hosts. And these are called stepping stones. So the idea is that your attack goes, rather than going directly to your target, it goes across these stepping stones one by one and finally arrives there. And this is actually a trick that we use in the anonymity community, is that unless you really are watching all of the sequence of the stepping stones, and you put one in Asia, one in Africa, there's lots of places to get compromised computers, you're not going to be able to trace things back. So one of the goals of our work is to be able to detect the existence of such stepping stones. And to detect them, what we do is we look at the link between some computer and the internet. Now note this actually has to be done not at the attacked ISP, but at the ISP or organization or of the person hosting this computer. But this can also be done inside a network intrusion detection system, so you can do this for many, many hosts at once. And the basic idea is that you have the bad guy here in a hoodie who wants to send some traffic to your attacked hosts, and so his data gets forwarded to the compromised computer, and then gets forwarded again to the internet. And so you can kind of see that if you look at the pattern of packets arriving here and the pattern of packets departing here, they follow the same timing and size. They exhibit the same timing and size signature. And they're probably not quite as crooked as the ones I have here. And so there's two ways of trying to exploit this information to detect stepping stones. The first is that you can do just basic correlation of these patterns. Now, you're not going to see an exact copy of this pattern over here. And there's a number of things that come into play that will cause this pattern here be slightly different than this pattern here. There's going to be delays in the network. There might be some packets lost, added, and so on. But you'll see something that's pretty close. An alternate approach, and this is something that we've been working on, is to create what's called a watermark. What we're going to do is, as these packets arrive into some computer, we're going to change their timing signature a little bit. We're going to delay some packets just slightly. And the idea is that we're going to insert a more recognizable and a more robust pattern into the timings of these packets, and it will be easier for us to see it on the way out. And there's a couple of ways that it becomes easier, and so I think I'll have time to explain both of them. And so this is the basic concept, is that we want to detect these stepping stones by creating a watermark that applies to an incoming flow, and then watching for the presence of the same watermark, the same pattern, leaving, going back out onto the internet. And if you see those two things, then you know that somebody's relaying traffic. And then you can suspect that something malicious is going on, though, as with everything that I discuss here, it probably requires more human action afterwards, because there are legitimate reasons why you might want to relay traffic through somebody's computer. So the work that I want to discuss is two systems. The first system is called Rainbow, and it's a watermarking system. And there have been a little bit of work before we started looking into this space on designing watermarks for network traffic. Obviously, watermarks for digital media is something that have been around for much longer, but the properties there are slightly different. But I think the work wasn't very kind of well organized, and one of the things that we started out is try to identify what kind of things an ideal watermark should have. And so the first goal, and this is in fact nobody else even tried to do this for some reason, is low distortion. And what it means is that as we're inserting this watermark here, we're going to modify the packet timings. We're going to introduce delays. And you can think about this as distortion of the network traffic. But basically, we're going to delay network traffic. And if we're going to do this detection effectively, we're going to need to do this on all incoming traffic, right? Because a priori, we don't know whether traffic is malicious or non-malicious. We don't know if it's being relayed. So what we want to do is we want to have something that we can apply to all incoming traffic. And therefore, because 99.999% of all traffic is not malicious, or at least it used to be the case, we want to make sure that the effect that we have on legitimate traffic is minimal. And like I said, it seems to make sense, but if you look at a lot of the work that people have done, they introduce delays of up to a second in some cases on a packet, and and this is basically taking your nice internet connection and throwing it back 2 decades in terms of usability. So it's not nearly as practical. The second thing that we wanted to do something that's invisible, and we want to resist the ability to have somebody detect the watermark. And this is mostly, there's a couple of reasons why you'd want to do that. Largely, if you think that a watermark is easy to detect, then you could, in theory, try to enable some countermeasures. In practice, all you're really going to do is go to some other stepping stone, because there's lots and lots of poorly defended computers out there. So if it's easy to detect that this computer is under good protection, then people are going to avoid it. Now, this is, of course, good for you, but not as good for the overall security of the internet. And finally, we wanted to do something that's robust, that survives various kinds of modification. And there's two things that, in this design, we eliminated from our criteria. And the first one is what I call active robustness. So if you think about this compromised computer, and you think about the patterns of packets that are inserted here, if this computer is using traffic, is doing something a little bit smarter, it could potentially insert its own distortion into the traffic delays. It could delay some packets, it could drop some packets, it could take various types of active measures to ensure that this pattern is different from this pattern. And so it's easy to see that if the attacker has an unbounded capability of doing this, if he can have an unbounded ability to modify the pattern as it traverses the computer, there's nothing you can do information theoretically. So there's been some work that looks at attackers that have a bounded capability to modify watermarks, but there's never really been a good study, and we don't really have a good intuition for figuring out how to make that bound. Because some people try to design these bounds in terms of usability. Again, it says, well, an internet connection is really annoying to use if you have more than a half-second delay. And this is true, but if you're an attacker, what's really annoying for me when I'm trying to get my work done might be quite tolerable for an attacker who says, okay, fine, this will be a little slow, but this will get me, access to my botnet, and this will get me, tens of thousands or millions of dollars. So the question about how much attackers can tolerate is not something that's well investigated. So what that does mean is that this work is something that is susceptible to potential countermeasures from the attackers. But on the flip side, it raises the bar that the attackers have to cross. It detects a lot of the present attacks, which there are some scenarios where, in fact, countermeasures might be difficult to deploy. But I won't go into this. And then the other non-goal. Actually, I'm going to wait to explain this later. So the way that we would perform watermarking in Rainbow is to say we're going to generate some pseudorandom sequence of zeros and ones. And this pseudorandom sequence, it has, there's a couple of properties you might want. The real thing that you want is that the sequence has to be unpredictable. So there are cryptographic tools that can easily fulfill this role. And you need to remember what sequence you generated, but it turns out that you can also, there's tools that let you generate a long sequence from a short seed. So really all you need to remember is a fairly short seed that is hard to guess. So something random. And then based on this sequence, all we do is as we receive the packets, we will delay or speed them up such that the inner packet delay is modified by either plus A or minus A based on the value of this bit. So I said that we delay or speed up packets. Now, of course, in real life, you can easily add latency to a packet that traverses your network. It's a little hard to subtract it. I can't send the packet 5 milliseconds before I received it. So what we do is that we create some sort of initial buffer of a delay, and we actually create a biased sequence such that the cumulative sum of all of these changes are within some threshold. And unfortunately, this does mean that the sequence is not random, but I think it's, we haven't proved it analytically. I think it's still fairly difficult to predict. And then this amount of interpacket delay is comparable to the network jitter, and which is the kind of the variance in the delay of normal packets. And this is what gives us invisibility, is that normal packets, as they traverse the network, they suffer delays that are non-uniform. They have a little bit of variance. And so if we add delays that are comparable, that are on the same order, then it becomes difficult for somebody to identify that a watermark has been applied. And on the flip side, we're not impacting, once again, we're not having a huge impact on the quality of service that is presented here because the delay we're introducing is comparable to what's already out there, right? And this is, once again, just something that intuitively makes sense, but if you read the early literature, once again, they introduce delays that are orders of magnitude larger of what's naturally there. And so we can show, these are actually slightly old results. I have some newer ones that we can show that the detection performance of this scheme can be fairly good in the sense that, depending on kind of how large a delay we want to insert, whether we want it to be slightly larger or slightly smaller than the jitter, somewhere between a few hundred to a few thousand packets is enough to identify a watermark with very low error probability. And we want to achieve very low error probabilities here. This is a log scale, so this would represent 10 to the minus 6. Because if you think about it, you're going to be relaying, if you want to implement this at an organization, think of how many network connections go in and out of Purdue every day. If you marked one of every 1,000 of them as potentially malicious, your network admins would quit, right? Because there's no way they could possibly scan through all of them. So you need to have really low error rates. And so this is some experimental results that we have, and basically what it shows is that once we receive a watermark pattern, we compute the correlation of what was sent out and what we received, and you can see these are kind of roughly a standard deviation bar, though the error is not normally distributed, but that even for short sequences, you get pretty good separation between the correlation you would get with something that is not watermarked. This is something where the pattern doesn't exist, and the correlation you have where something is watermarked. And I'm not going to explain this further because actually we're just finishing up some new results that have a slightly better signal processing and detection. So if you're really curious about how well this works, I'll be able to tell you something interesting in about a couple weeks. And so the place where we think that something like Rainbow would be applicable is some sort of enterprise with a single border gateway. So if we think about kind of, if I go back here just a little bit. Right, so the place where we'd really want to run something like Rainbow is here. If you have an organization that's connected by a single gateway to the internet, this is a perfect place to run Rainbow because it's fairly low overhead. It allows you to mark all the traffic that goes in and inspect all the traffic that goes out. And so let me flash forward a bit. Now, there are some organizations that have several border gateways, and I think Purdue is likely to be one of them. And this is the idea is that, actually I'm not sure if Purdue is, but there are some organizations that have several border gateways, and the idea is that they're connected to the internet through more than one spot. They have several internet providers, and so depending on where connections are going and coming from, they might leave and enter in different places. And so Rainbow actually becomes a little bit higher overhead for situations like that. And the reason for that is that for our correlation computation, something that we require is that we need you to not only remember the watermark pattern, but we also need to remember the actual traffic pattern that exists in the traffic. So you kind of need to store a short-term but perhaps high-volume log of the timings of packets that have been arriving at your system. This storage is fairly small, so even for a busy gateway, this can fit into a few gigabytes of RAM, which is free now. But if you have several border gateways, you would need to communicate all this information across your enterprise in real time, and so that becomes costly. And the other thing is that it would be really nice to deploy these kind of things in a large ISP. If we think about it, the organization that we really want to running this is like Comcast. Because Comcast provides connectivity to millions of home users who have no IT experience, who have no IT support, and so they're running old, unpatched systems. And they're where most of these plentiful targets for stepping stones, that's where they are. But Comcast can't really do the scale because Comcast has lots of connectivity, lots of flows, and so this kind of communication doesn't really scale. So the next thing that we did was look at creating a blind watermark. And a blind watermark, and so the idea is that in Rainbow we messed with the pattern a little bit, and then we did some correlation on incoming and outgoing flow. What you can do instead is that imagine you had full control of the pattern. If you just inserted some sort of square wave into the pattern of the packet timings as it arrives into your flow. If all of them followed the same pattern, then if you see that square wave or that whatever pattern you inserted going out, then you know you've detected something that's been relayed, and you don't need to keep a list of what happened when you got in because you've effectively, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they looked like originally. So a blind watermark is something that gives you that kind of detection ability while not actually modifying the traffic all that much. So what it does is it creates a small delta, a small modification to the actual network traffic that can later be recognized without knowing what the original traffic was. So it's this kind of recognizable pattern. We use the data-dependent watermark to avoid some of the attacks that we had previously developed on watermarking work. So I'll give you just a brief sketch of how this works. What we can do is we take the flow and split it up into a timeline, and the timeline is split into intervals. And these intervals are really, they're just, let's say, I think they're shorter than that, but let's say 1 second each. So we divide them into second-long intervals. We select two special intervals, a base interval and a mark interval. And the base interval is, we don't do anything to the packets. But the mark interval, we do some sort of modification such that the interval has a pattern that's actually dependent on what the base interval is like. So I'll, for figuring out what kind of transform we use, we basically compute a statistic and quantize it. So we compute a feature of this interval that's close to uniformly distributed. It's called a centroid in this case. And then based on that, we figure out how we're going to transform the mark interval. And our transformation, the way it works is that it takes a long interval, this whole thing might be 1 second, and then splits it up into shorter subintervals, and then shifts all the traffic to the kind of these positions within the interval. So relatively straightforward, but the nice thing is that if you know what to look for, if you want to verify that these things are in the right position, then it's fairly easy to do, and you can do it with a relatively low error rate. But if you don't even know what positions to look at, because you don't know where the base interval is, then this is hard to distinguish from what normal traffic looks like. And so we can get similar error rates to something like Rainbow. The performance is a little bit worse in terms of the sizes of the flows that we need to watermark. So Rainbow works on pretty short flows. Here we need the flows to be slightly longer. On the other hand, the performance of detection, once we actually watermark the flow, the computational performance is really fast, because if you, in Rainbow, you had to match every incoming flow to every outgoing flow. In SWIRL, all you have to do is look for a pattern on every outgoing flow. So there's no longer a match process, and so now it goes from order n to order n squared to order n computation. And the more important part is that you can implement this in all of the gateways of your network, and these gateways do not need to communicate with each other after they've shared some of the initial parameters. Any questions so far? Because I'm going to switch gears a bit. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the, like you said, it works for sparse traffic.
Yeah.
And because what you needed to do is some kind of densification or make it bursty.
Something like that, or at least rearrange the pattern. We need to insert
two bursts.
Right, right.
So
that's right.
Why not in the case of, in the other case of dense traffic, do something that is the reverse, that would be sparsification or burst of emptiness?
So I think that the issue with that is that if we, to be robust to some small jitter, we need to make these bursts. Well, kind of one of the ways to think about it is that if the traffic's pretty dense, then if I create an empty space here, then the effect of that empty space is going to propagate fairly far into the rest of the traffic, because I'm going to need to shift this data into the next interval. But that one's already pretty full, so we need to shift things along. So, I mean, we haven't really played around with this, but I'm worried that that might be an issue.
That's a good answer. So it's not symmetric.
No, it's not. It's and the reason is that in the sparse case, it's a lot easier to move a packet. If you move a packet from one spot to another, you're not affecting other people as much. Okay, so we looked at how we can identify these stepping stones. But of course, stepping stones are only part of the problem. There's a larger problem that people face, which is called botnets. And there's some relationship between them, because so what a botnet is, like I said, it's a coordinated attack platform. You compromise 10,000 computers, or you compromise 1 million computers. You get them all communicating with each other in some sort of protocol so that they all act as a single distributed system. You know, people early on, people used to call them armies of zombies, because the compromised computers were called zombies. And then you use them to perform various kinds of attacks. So for example, if you've ever gotten a spam message, it probably came from a botnet, because that gives you, by using thousands of millions of people's computers, you can send very large quantities of mail, even if you don't send a lot of mail every second. You can do denial of service attacks, you can steal information. And so there's kind of a relationship between botnets and stepping stones, in that usually what botnets are, you create this kind of coordinated cloud, and then a bot master would use a bunch of stepping stones to hook into it, to control it from there. So if we can identify this cloud, right, then by identifying stepping stones, we might be able to trace back to who's controlling it. But how do we identify that there's an attack in the first place? Given in the face of all the challenges. So there's, like I mentioned earlier, misuse detection or anomaly detection doesn't work very well because you can take countermeasures. There's been some work on doing, on looking for clustering behavior. And so what it says is that, if your botnet is just infecting, 10,000 computers to do this one task, then these 10,000 computers will have some similarities in there in what they're doing, both from a host side and from a network side. And if you try to cluster them together, you might be able to find things. Now, this is actually something that could potentially be susceptible to a countermeasure, because just because you create 10,000 botnets and you put them on some task, they don't need to behave exactly the same. You could introduce some artificial heterogeneity, but I won't get into that. What we're going to focus on is looking at the communication infrastructure that botnets need to use. So the thing that makes a botnet rather than just a loose collection, list of compromised computers, is that this botnet is coordinated. There's some communication that happens among all of them. And initially, this used to be through things like IRC channels or some centralized servers that send a command to 10,000 nodes. This turns out has some scaling issues, and it also has this resilience and detection issues. People find these IRC channels, people find these nodes that communicate with thousands of others or tens of thousands of others. They shut them down, and then you're in worse shape. So, but the botnet authors, they have been paying attention to what some of computer researchers have been doing. And computer researchers have said, we can create nice coordinated networks that don't have any central point, but that still have some useful properties, right? So and this is very nice for botnets. So people have designed systems that are free of central nodes. They've designed systems that provide very, very efficient communication from one node to another. So I mean, the people who were doing all this research in the early part of, I guess, this about 2001, 2005, there's been a lot of important work there. They were doing a great service for the botnet authors. I mean, that's not why they did it, but they created something that's an almost ideal structure for botnets. Efficient communication, resilient to nodes coming and going. You want to have a structure that's very robust, because in the botnet, of course, a bunch of computers get shut down. You have no control over when computers get removed and added from your network. And so the best kind of peer-to-peer network, best of breed, are called structured peer-to-peer networks that are designed to follow a particular mathematical formula in how they connect up. And there's some very nice properties that they have. You can have a very low node degree while still having a very efficient communication from any node. You can get pretty good networks that work with a node degree of about 20. So each node can talk to only 20 other computers, but it can still efficiently reach millions. And you might even be able to go less than 20. And they have high expansion, which is related to efficient communication. And so if you have something that has low node degree and it has a communication with a small number of other hosts, that's going to be hard to identify as suspicious. I mean, my computer here, probably only while it's been here, has probably communicated with a couple dozen other hosts on the internet, right? So you can't say, oh, well, this looks suspiciously like a botnet. But something that we decided to look at is this question of, if you take a broader perspective, rather than looking at a single computer, but looking at a broader communication pattern, can you see that there's a peer-to-peer network there? So to explain what we're doing, I'm going to talk to you briefly about the structure of the internet and how it relates to our work. So the internet is a semi-hierarchical system. You have kind of these little fish ISPs that provide your service, then you have the bigger fish that also interconnect, and you have, at the very top, you have a small collection of tier 1 ISPs. And some of these are ones you would have heard of, you know, AT&T, Verizon, some of those maybe not. But these ISPs actually provide the majority of long-distance links on the internet. And the other thing is that these ISPs, they actually keep logs of traffic. I know, sometimes it's kind of scary, but they don't log every single packet, but they log summary statistics about all the traffic that they forward. And people at AT&T, for example, have done some great research trying to put this to use. And so what we've decided is saying, well, how much of a botnet communication structure would you be able to see if you had access to one or several of these ISPs? So it's surprising. If you had one and you picked kind of the top one, I forget if this is AT&T or not, you would see 20%. So 1 in 5 links between all botnet nodes, and we did this for simulation and internet mapping, goes through a single ISP. Right? So just these guys, if they say that we want to make the internet better, we're going to put our logs to use, they can actually see quite a bit. And once you start getting a few people collaborating, you can get to 50% pretty quickly. You actually have fewer than 100 ISPs are needed for almost complete coverage. And what we want to say is that, okay, well, if we take these ISPs, one thing we can do is we can just get all of their logs and say which computers have talked to which other computers and build a graph out of that. This is not the same as the internet topology. It's kind of the internet communication topology. And there's a little bit of probability theory that goes into this, but there's a way, if you model the graph as a Markov chain, you can figure out how quickly this Markov chain converges to stationary, which is a near uniform distribution. And something that we have found in the past, and this is kind of almost inherent, is that good peer-to-peer networks will have this characteristic that if a random walk in starting at the point in the peer-to-peer network will reach every other node with close to uniform probability after a short number of steps. So I don't have time to explain this more, but so the idea is that we need to find, we have this communication graph, and we want to find a graph that is fast mixed and has this kind of property. Now, the only issue is that the subgraph is going to be the size of a botnet. It's going to be, maybe 1,000 or 1,000,000 nodes. The overall graph is going to have hundreds of millions of nodes. So obviously, we can't enumerate all the possibilities. So we're use a sampling technique to find what are called low conductance cuts. So we do, we have this Markov chain Monte Carlo technique that allows you to sample subsets that are connected to the rest of the graph by, where effectively, you can call them sparse cuts. You can have basically cuts that have a low amount of traffic potential. And by doing this recursively, we can actually identify the graph. So I'm going to skip the description of these algorithms. This is a paper that we've published in Using Security 2010. And so you can read the full description of algorithms there. But I just want to show you some of the results we have. What we did is that we took a 3 million node data set that we had available. We did some tricks to extend it to a 30 million node data set. And then we injected a peer-to-peer network of various sizes. And we're able to detect a pretty large fraction of all the nodes with a small amount of false positives. And if you think about trying to find a 1,000 node peer-to-peer network inside a 30 million node graph. This is really a needle in a haystack type operation, but it turns out that you can do this fairly efficiently. And the other point I wanted to make is we looked at some representative topologies of peer-to-peer networks. For example, Kademlia is a favorite among botnet authors because there's a easily available implementation of it, so they don't have to go and spend the kind of time that the grad students in 2003 to 2005 did, for months trying to get a prototype of this running. They can actually get it. But the question is, can botnet designers use other types of topologies to try to avoid our detection? What? And the answer is not here. And so the answer is they can. So there was this kind of stealthy topology that was proposed in a conference in 2009, and they modified the core topology to be more stealthy, and you can see that our error rates, they're not still not too high, but they're significantly worse than for the normal structured topology. And you can imagine, these are some small tweaks they did. You can imagine doing more and more tweaks. But we actually suspect that there's a fundamental trade-off that happens here. This is a graph of the percentage of failed end-to-end paths. This is the percentage of two nodes who can't talk to each other, given the percentage of nodes that might have failed at any given time. So kind of if you take a peer-to-peer network, you have some nodes leave, and then you don't have a chance to repair it. So this is something that will obviously happen a lot to botnet networks. The core topology, designed by researchers to be efficient, does really well on this. You can have half the nodes go away, and still most of the paths will still work. On the other hand, the stealthy topology does really poorly at this. Even if 10% of the nodes goes away, you have a lot of failures, and by the time you have 20 or 30, your network is basically gone. So this is, like I said, we don't have a proof of this, but we feel that there might be some fundamental trade-off there. So I think I'm supposed to finish at 5:20, so I'm going to skip the last couple slides and just kind of break down to the conclusion. So the main thing that I found in the last few years of research on this topic is that traffic analysis can be a quite useful security tool. It's something that I came across with looking at it from kind of the other side of trying to looking at how people can use traffic analysis to compromise their privacy. And if you think about AT&T and network logs, then you kind of also see the connection there. But they are a useful security tool, and I think that they're definitely worth exploring. And the other thing is that I think it's really interesting to take all of these data that's being collected by these large ISPs and see if we can find new possibilities for defending against attacks. And it might in fact be the only way to really do this, because if you have some global organization with millions of nodes that is trying to attack you and trying to protect itself from failure and trying to be stealthy, and you're trying to go at it with, just by looking at a couple of network links that go through your own organization, you're kind of at a disadvantage. On the other hand, in network defenses, even the tables, even the odds a little bit. And so I think there's interesting new work that we've done there. Thanks.